It was an early autumn evening, and 300 candles had been lit in the Buckinghamshire estate. To be honest, I didn't understand why a matchmaking party had to be staged like a rehearsal for a coronation. When the maid pinned the 6th pearl hairpin into my hair, my scalp tightened so much I felt like rolling my eyes, but I held back, because my father, the Earl of Ashby, was already standing in the hallway, urging me 3 times in that our family can't afford to lose tone. As the carriage rolled along the cobblestones, my mother clasped my hand, her lips pressed into a pale line. "Lillian," she said, her voice so low it seemed she feared the coachman might hear, "this is the 4th time. If the Duke of Ashton refuses the introduction again tonight, your father says—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. The news had spread throughout the entire London social season. The eldest daughter of the Ashby family had been turned away by the Duke of Ashton 3 times. The first time, he said he was unwell. The second time, he said he was already engaged. The third time was even more blunt. The Duke's butler stood at the door, wouldn't even let her in, and simply handed out a note that read, "Do not return. Do not come again." Those 4 words nearly destroyed me. Do you know what it means in those circles for a noblewoman to be rejected so publicly? It means your lineage, your beauty, your upbringing, all of it is trampled into the mud before everyone's eyes. It means other families will never seriously consider a marriage alliance with you. It means I have become the laughingstock of high society. But my father wouldn't give up. He pinned his hopes on a 4th introduction, the Marquise de Brandon's autumn ball, the final grand gathering before the end of the social season. My father pulled every string he had in the Foreign Office to persuade, no, practically coerce, the Marquise de Brandon to intervene, personally ensuring that the Duke of Ashton would just happen to cross paths with me that evening. "Coincidence," I murmured, repeating the word to my reflection in the carriage window. How ironic. The entire fate of an aristocratic young lady hinges on whether a man is willing to coincidentally glance your way. Outside the window, the sky was iron gray, pressing down on the low hills. The late October wind, carrying the scent of oak and cold earth, seeped through the cracks, sending a chill down my neck. I pulled my cloak tighter, dark green, a color my mother said complemented my red hair, while my mind wandered to what the legendary Duke of Ashton might actually be like. There were so many rumors about him. Some say he inherited the cold-bloodedness of the Normans, capable of shooting his opponent dead in a duel without batting an eye. Others say he keeps wolves on his estate, real wolves, the kind that howl in the moonlight. Still others claim his first wife, the poor Lady Eleanor, who died of illness less than 2 years after her marriage, was actually driven mad by him. Of course, there are also those who say the Duke of Ashton is the royal family's most loyal pillar, commanding the military forces of 3 northern counties. The man the king both fears and relies on most. But all the rumors point to the same conclusion. This man is as cold as the rocks on the north coast, and I am to marry him. Or rather, my father wants me to marry him. The carriage rounded the final bend, and the outline of Brandon Manor emerged from the twilight. It was a white Georgian-style building, as symmetrical as a poker face. Candlelight streaming through the windows bathed the lawn in a warm orange glow, and a long row of family crests lined the carriageway. I heard the distant sound of strings, along with the rustle of women's skirts, brushing against one another. "Remember," my mother said, grabbing my wrist before I stepped down, so tightly that her nails nearly dug into my flesh. "Smile, say little. Don't act like you do at home, always trying to show off your book smarts. The Duke of Ashton doesn't like women who are too clever." I didn't answer. I simply lifted my skirt, stepped down from the carriage onto the servant's arms, and walked up the white stone steps leading to the ballroom. The wind rushed into my ears, and I could hear my own heartbeat, heavy and muffled, like a drum wrapped in velvet. The ballroom was even larger than I had imagined. The dome was painted with the gods of Greek mythology, and crystal chandeliers hung from it, shining like frozen waterfalls. The air was thick with the scent of champagne, lily pollen, and the expensive musk-scented perfumes worn by the aristocrats. People were everywhere. The men wore dark tailcoats with snow, white bow ties. The women's skirts billowed like upside-down hydrangeas, and jewels sparkled around their necks and wrists. Laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the melodies of the string quartet wove a dense, insincere web beneath the dome. When Lady Brandon came to greet us, her smile was so forced it looked almost anxious. She exchanged a few pleasantries with my parents, then lowered her voice and cast a quick glance toward a corner deep within the ballroom. "He's over there," she said, her throat a little dry. "He doesn't seem to be in too bad a mood tonight. At least he hasn't left early. But I must warn you, the Viscount Lennox's daughter has already tried her luck." "And what was the result?" my mother asked. Mrs. Brandon didn't answer. She merely shook her head slightly. My heart sank. The young lady of the Lennox family was widely regarded as the beauty of the season, if even she had been rejected. "Miss Lillian." Mrs. Brandon turned to me, her voice taking on a solemn tone that bordered on pleading. "When I take you over there in a moment, please remember, don't ask him any questions. Don't try to catch his attention. Don't do anything that might be interpreted as offensive." I finished her sentence for her. "Number," she smiled, but the smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "It's disturbing. The Duke of Ashton does not like to be disturbed." I took a deep breath. The air around me suddenly grew stifling and thick. The string music had shifted to Bach at some point, its rhythm as steady as a marching column. I followed Lady Brandon through the crowd, my skirt sweeping across the cool marble floor, my fingertips unconsciously clenching the fan. Then, I spotted him in the distance. The Duke of Ashton stood beside an arched floor-to-ceiling window flanked by perhaps 7 or 8 people, all of them the most prominent nobles in the country. The Chancellor was smiling, but his smile was cautious. A general from the Northern Legion was speaking, though he unconsciously kept his back slightly hunched as he did so. Everyone was drawn toward him, like iron filings around a magnet, held fast by some invisible force. And he, himself, he was younger than I had imagined. In his early 30s at most, his black hair was neatly combed back, his sideburns trimmed with meticulous precision. His features were chiseled as if carved with a knife, high brow bones, a jawline hard and sharp. He wore a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, a small silver insignia pinned to the lapel, the royal emblem, signifying that the same blood as the king flowed through his veins. But what truly held one's gaze were his eyes. Those eyes were a pale gray blue, like a lake covered in thin winter ice. He wasn't looking at anyone. His gaze swept past the crowd, resting on some distant void, as if this banquet, with its clinking glasses and mingling voices, were nothing more than a negligible background noise to him. His expression wasn't indifference. Indifference at least implies some kind of attitude, but a complete bone, deep detachment. It was as if he were standing on the edge of the world, while everyone else was merely performing behind a pane of glass. Mrs. Brandon cleared her throat and led me into that magnetic field. "Your Grace," her voice suddenly turned, as cloyingly sweet as syrup, "allow me to introduce the Ashbys." "No need." He didn't even turn his head. He merely raised a hand clad in a black leather glove and very lightly, very casually, made a dismissive gesture in the air. The movement was small, yet as precise as a surgeon's scalpel, cutting off Mrs. Brandon's words in an instant. The air froze. I felt the stares of those around us, filled with pity, schadenfreude, and that polite cruelty the aristocracy excels at. Mrs. Brandon's face flushed crimson. Her lips moved as if to say something more, but the Duke of Ashton had already turned away, his back to us, and begun speaking to the general. His voice was low, as if coming from the depths of his chest. I could not make out the words clearly, catching only one. 4 times. The 4th time. I stood there, feeling the blood drain from my face to my feet, my cheeks burning while my palms grew as cold as if I were clutching a block of ice. From somewhere behind me, I heard a faint, stifled chuckle, but I didn't speak, nor did I run back to the carriage with red-rimmed eyes, as I had on the 3 previous nights I'd been rejected. I didn't know why. Perhaps because I'd grown accustomed to humiliation, or perhaps because tonight's moonlight was too pale, casting everything in the glow of an absurd stage play. I simply lifted my head and cast a calm, emotionless glance at the Duke of Ashton's profile. Then I turned and walked away on my own. Lady Brandon caught up to me, wanting to say something, but I smiled and waved her off, saying I wanted to get some fresh air. I crossed the ballroom and exited through a side door. The candlelight in the corridor was much dimmer, and the scent of flowers in the air had grown faint, replaced by the musty smell of old book pages and aged wood. I wandered aimlessly down the corridor, my high heels clacking hollowly against the dark oak floor. I didn't know where I had ended up. I pushed open a half-closed walnut door to find a study of moderate size. Bookshelves lined 2 walls, stretching from floor to ceiling. The collection wasn't extensive, but the books were in excellent condition. On the west wall was an arched window. The curtains were drawn back, revealing a deep blue twilight sky and a moon that had already begun to turn pale. Beneath the window stood a small mahogany table, upon which lay an open book. I walked over and glanced down at it. It was an early 18th century edition of Milton's poems. The leather binding was somewhat worn and mottled, but well preserved. Affixed to the title page was a handwritten bookplate, the Brandon family crest and motto, Adere et Gloria. The handwriting was elegant. It must have been the work of a tutor, but something didn't feel quite right. That tutor clearly wasn't particularly skilled in Latin. He had written adire as adierer, a spelling mistake, minor, yet like a drop of ink on white paper, made the entire bookplate seem cheap. I frowned instinctively. Then I did something that would surely have earned me a scolding from my mother at a dinner party. I pulled a fine-tipped quill from the nearby penholder, dipped it in ink, leaned over, and gently crossed out the incorrect letter, writing the correct spelling in the blank space beside it. My movements were light and steady, for I had spent my childhood helping to organize rare books in my father's library, and I had done this 1,000 times before. As I returned the quill to the holder, I straightened up and examined the tiny correction. A sense of almost childish, incongruous satisfaction welling up inside me. Then, I heard the sound of a door being pushed open behind me. The hinges turned very slowly, emitting a low, heavy, grinding sound. Suddenly, a scent filled the air, cedar, leather, and a faint masculine scent as cold and crisp as the frozen soil of the north. I didn't turn around, but I sensed it. Someone was standing in the doorway, watching me. That gaze rested on my back, not a fleeting glance, nor the polite yet cruel stares from the banquet earlier. That gaze was deep and heavy, like a blade being slowly drawn, carrying something indefinable: scrutiny, curiosity, or something else. The room was silent for about 10 seconds. Then, a deep voice came from the doorway, its tone carrying a hint of hoarseness, as if he hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. "What are you doing?" I turned around. The Duke of Ashton was leaning against the doorframe, his gray-blue eyes, the same eyes that had been as frozen as a lake just moments ago at the banquet, now fixed directly and unflinchingly upon me. And this time, there was warmth in his eyes. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the faint glow of the remaining candles in the hallway, his expression hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make it out clearly, but those eyes, The same eyes that had looked like a frozen lake just moments ago at the banquet were now fixed intently on me, carrying an expression I couldn't immediately identify. Not anger, not contempt, not even surprise. It was more like something that had been buried deep for a long time had suddenly been unearthed. I instinctively took a half step back, my skirt brushing against the leg of the mahogany table. My fingertips were still stained with a bit of ink, and I quietly tucked them into the palm of my hand. I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected, correcting a spelling error. He didn't move. He remained leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest. One of his black leather gloves had been removed, revealing a slender, knuckled finger. His gaze slowly shifted from my face to the open volume of Milton's poetry on the table, then back to my face. Latin? Yes, Your Excellency. You know the ex libris belongs to the Brandon family, not to you. Don't you? His tone was flat, betraying no emotion, but the question itself carried a sharp, testing edge, like placing a dagger flat on the table to see if you'd be foolish enough to reach out and touch the blade. I took a deep breath. The wind from outside squeezed through the window crack, sending a faint chill through the strands of hair at the nape of my neck. I looked at him, striving to keep my voice steady and confident. I know, but wrong is wrong. Spelling adhere incorrectly is like tearing the very word adherence in half. A volume of Milton's poetry should not be leafed through bearing such a scar. Silence. Absolute, utter silence. Not a sound to be heard. The strings in the hallway had stopped at some point. Perhaps it was a pause between movements, or perhaps the walls here were simply too thick. I heard my heartbeat grow heavy again, and the faint crackling of the candles in their brass holders. Then, the Duke of Ashton moved. He uncrossed his arms and walked slowly toward me. His pace was neither fast nor heavy, yet each step on the wooden floor carried a resolute, muffled echo. The scent of cedar and frozen earth grew stronger as he approached, so strong that I could almost feel a faint sting in my nostrils. He stopped on the other side of the mahogany table. He looked down at the poetry collection. The hand in the leather glove reached out, its fingertips pressing gently against the spot where the bookplate had been repositioned, lingering there for about 3 seconds. Then, he looked up at me. This time, he was too close. Close enough for me to make out the fine, dark lines in his gray-blue irises, and the faint, old scar at the tail of his left eyebrow. His lips twitched as if to speak, but in the end, no sound came out. In that instant, I was suddenly struck by a strange intuition. This man wasn't scrutinizing me. He was verifying me. It was as if he had recognized something he thought had long since vanished from this world, only to suddenly see it again on the finger of a stranger. But that look vanished in a flash, as quickly as a candle flame flickers in the wind. He withdrew his hand, took a step back, and resumed his cold, aloof expression. You're from the Ashby family. It wasn't a question. He stated it matter-of-factly. Yes. I clenched the ink stain in my palm. Your father is the Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. Yes. You were brought here tonight. His voice remained flat, but his tone dropped slightly on the last word. To meet me. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, like a judge reading a verdict. My face began to burn again. The heat rose from my neck all the way to my ears. In that moment, I truly wanted to turn and walk away, to flee from this suffocating man, to return to the carriage, and bury my face in my mother's shoulder to cry. But I didn't, because after he said that, he added one more thing. Stop. It was the tone one uses to command a servant, unquestionable, carrying a certain innate, zero tolerance for refusal. He tilted his head slightly, his gaze shifting from my face to my clenched hands, then back again. Sit down. He pointed to a leather armchair by the window in the library. The chair looked old. its arms worn smooth with a glossy sheen. "I am not your subordinate, your grace," I said. My voice was quiet, but I enunciated every word clearly. The air froze once more. The Duke's eyes narrowed slightly. It wasn't a threat, but more like a recalibration, as if he used a fixed formula to analyze everyone who approached him, and the data I provided fell outside his preset parameters. He didn't speak, nor did he order me to sit down again. He simply turned away, walked to the window, stood with his back to me, slipped his gloveless hand into his tailcoat pocket, and gazed out at the sky, which had grown completely dark. Silence spread, thick as a winter blanket. I thought this silence would crush everything, reduce what remained of my self-respect tonight to dust. But he spoke, his voice much softer than before, as if he were speaking to himself. Eleanor often corrected mistakes in books, too. Eleanor. That name was like a needle, piercing a tender spot in my chest. Mrs. Eleanor, his first wife, the woman who had died of illness less than 2 years after their marriage. The woman described in every rumor as poor, unfortunate, like a canary locked away in a northern manor. I stood there not knowing what to say. Usually in such situations, the standard response for a young lady of the nobility would be, "I am deeply sorry for your loss," or "She must have been a wonderful person." But those words circled in my throat, and in the end, not a single one came out, because they all sounded too hollow, too fake, like pouring a cup of water into the ocean. He turned and looked at my silence. Then his lips twitched. I thought he was going to smile, but he didn't. He merely gave a slight nod, a movement so small it was almost imperceptible. "What does your father want?" The topic burst in like a door, suddenly kicked open. A cold wind rushed in all at once. I froze. "What?" "Your father, Earl Ashby of the Foreign Office." His tone returned to the cool precision of the negotiating table. "This is the 4th time. What does he need? The support of the Northern Legion, voting rights in the duchy, or intelligence channels within the royal cabinet?" With every item he listed, my heart sank another inch, because everything he said was true. My father is Under-Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, but while the position looks glamorous, its foundation is shaky. The Queen is elderly, the heir apparent is frail, and 3 factions within the cabinet are tearing each other apart. The Ashby family has inherited nothing from its ancestors, but a titular title and a mountain of debt. My father's ability to hold his ground in the diplomatic system relies entirely on political maneuvering and opportunism. He needs allies. He needs a bargaining chip that will ensure his survival, and that of the entire Ashby family, in the next round of power struggles. And the Duke of Ashton was the most valuable bargaining chip in the entire kingdom. His estates spanned the 3 northern counties, and he commanded 20,000 private soldiers. He was the Queen's cousin, his lineage pure enough to marry into any royal house. He never took a public stance in the cabinet, but everyone knew whichever side he stood on, victory would follow. My father wanted him, and so I was thrust here, like a pawn, like a living gift, like a calling card passed back and forth, accepted and returned time and again. I opened my mouth, trying to find something appropriate to say, but the Duke didn't give me the chance. "The 4th daughter," he said, his voice devoid of any sarcasm, merely stating a cold fact. "You've had 3 before. They've all gone back. What makes you think you can stay?" He took a step closer. Those gray-blue eyes had returned to the way they looked when I first saw them, like a frozen lake. But this time, beneath the ice, I saw something else. Caution, or some hope he dared not admit even to himself. "Because you altered that ex libris," he answered his own question. He took another step forward. Now he was less than 2 feet away from me. My head barely reached his chin, and when he looked down at me, I could almost feel his breath, No scent of champagne, only mint and some faintly bitter herb. A woman rejected for the 4th time at a ball, he said, enunciating each word clearly, who didn't run crying back to the carriage, didn't go to her mother to complain, didn't feign fainting to elicit sympathy. She ran to an unnoticed library and, with a quill pen, corrected a Latin error made by a governess who had been dead for 100 years. He paused. "Who are you?" The question came too suddenly. It wasn't like the interrogation from earlier, nor like the exchange of terms at a negotiating table. His tone rose slightly on the last syllable, carrying a hint of genuine bewilderment, as if I, my very existence, had opened a gap in his logically constructed world that could never be closed. My lips were dry. My heart was pounding as if someone were beating a drum. I could feel my fingertips trembling, but I forced myself to steady my voice. "Lillian Ashby, eldest daughter of the Ashby family," I said. "A hapless girl who's been turned away by you 3 times, who's trying for the 4th time tonight to just happen, to run into you, and has still failed, and who may never get married." I paused, lifted my head, and looked straight into his eyes. "But I will correct your Latin errors." Just then, the candle burned down a bit. The wick collapsed, and the flame flickered twice. The light dimmed for a moment, then brightened again. The Duke of Ashton looked at me for a very, very long time. Then he did something I'd never heard of in any of the rumors about him. He smiled. It wasn't the polite, insincere curve of a social gathering, nor could it even be called a real smile. Just the left corner of his mouth turning up ever so slightly, as faint as a ripple on a lake surface stirred by the wind. But in that instant, a small piece of the ice in his eyes shattered. It shattered gently, but it shattered nonetheless. "Lillian Ashby," he repeated my name, the syllables grinding against his deep voice as if he were savoring a flavor for the first time. "Do you know what it means to be associated with me? To become the target of the entire high society?" I retorted. The courage that had surged up from somewhere hadn't yet receded. "I already am, your lordship. 3 rejections have already pinned me to that target. Now, at most, someone is just sprinkling salt on the wound. More than that." He turned and walked back to the window, his back to me. Moonlight fell on his profile, making the sharp line of his jaw appear even more defined. "It means you'll be living in a northern estate, where winter lasts 5 months. The nearest neighbor is 20 miles away, and the servants dare not approach the east wing of the main house at night. It means you'll be entering a family that even the royal family fears. It means every one of your father's political enemies will see you as a tool they can use to blackmail me." He turned his head. His gray, blue eye glinted darkly in the candlelight. "It also means you'll likely not survive your 3rd winter. Eleanor didn't." The moment that name was spoken again, the air grew heavy. I heard the sound of a carriage passing in the distance outside the window, its wheels clattering on the gravel road. The candle flames in the library flickered in unison, as if the old house itself had shivered. I remained silent for a moment. "Did she die of an illness?" "Everyone says so." The Duke's voice was so low, it was barely audible, including the doctor. "Everyone says so, including the doctor." I dared not touch the thorn hidden within those words. At least not yet. I lowered my eyes to the open book of poetry on the table. Milton's verses lay quietly on the page in the candlelight, speaking of a lost paradise, souls destined for ruin, and the last glimmer of hope God had reserved for humanity. I reached out and closed the book. "Your Excellency," I said, my voice soft but steady, "you asked me just now what I thought allowed me to stay. I said I got the Latin right, but that wasn't the real answer." He turned to face me directly. "The real answer is," I took a deep breath, "I figured it out on my way here tonight. I no longer intend to go to great lengths to win your favor, nor do I intend to play the part of a proper, gentle and intelligent noblewoman any longer. You refused to grant me an audience 4 times. If the first 3 were insults, the 4th was a judgment. A judgment I have already lost completely. I looked up, so I have no reason to fear you any more. A gust of wind rushed in through a crack in the window, causing the candle flame to flicker violently and casting our 2 shadows onto the bookshelf, where they overlapped and then parted. The Duke looked at me and remained silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. His voice was hoarse and low, with long pauses between each word, as if he were slowly drawing them out from some deep, long untouched place. "Those words," he said. "Eleanor said them too." He walked to the door and stopped. He didn't look back. "Tomorrow at 2 in the afternoon, a carriage will be waiting at the gates of Ashby Manor. It will bear no coat of arms, and the coachman will not speak. If you're willing to get in, bring plenty of warm clothes. Winter at the Northern Manor will come earlier this year." The door closed slowly behind him, with a faint, muffled click. I stood in the library, alone. The candle's flame had finally steadied, no longer flickering. I looked down at the small smudge of ink on my fingertip that hadn't quite dried yet, black, tiny, like a fingerprint pressed against the signature of fate. The carriage pulled up in front of Ashby Manor at 2 o'clock sharp the following afternoon. Contrary to my expectations, it wasn't black. It was a deep, almost inky green, with no coat of arms on the bodywork. Even the metal fittings on the door handles had been painted a matte dark gray. The coachman wore a worn woolen coat with the collar turned up high, revealing only half of his weathered face. He saw me emerge from the porch, carrying my trunk, said nothing, but simply jumped down from the carriage and silently took the luggage from my hands. My mother did not see me off. She had cried at breakfast. Tears fell into her bone china teacup, mixing with the black tea, but she did not say a single word to dissuade me. My father stood by the window, his back to us, never turning around once. Only as the carriage pulled away did I catch a glimpse of his hand trembling as he drew back the curtain. Hooves clattered across the damp, late autumn cobblestones. London's grey sky shrank bit by bit in the rear window, finally swallowed up by the low oak groves of the countryside. The carriage smelled of aged leather and horsehair padding, and the seats were surprisingly soft. A small oil lamp was set into the side of the carriage. The wick was trimmed very short, and the flame was no bigger than a fingernail. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes for a moment. My mind was filled with images from last night. The Duke's silhouette standing at the entrance to the library. His words, "Make sure you bring enough warm clothes." The deep, barely perceptible hoarseness in his voice when he said Eleanor's name. That unconscious little gesture with his left hand, his index finger and thumb gently twisting, as if fingering a ring that wasn't there. And that final smile of his, if you could even call it a smile. The carriage journeyed northward, from day into evening, from evening into the dead of night. We changed horses once at a way station. The coachman tapped on the window and handed in a package wrapped in linen, bread, cold beef, and a small flask of hot tea. He still said nothing, merely glancing at me with eyes clouded by wind and sand, then nodding. The next morning, when I was jolted awake by the carriage's wheels rumbling over the gravel road, I pulled back the curtain and saw a world I didn't recognize. The gray sky hung so low, it seemed ready to press down onto the ground. On either side stretched endless wastelands, where withered ferns grew wildly from the cracks in the rocks, billowing in endless waves in the cold wind. In the distance were mountains, their ridges weighed down by snow, white as a row of silent teeth. The air was cold and sweet, carrying the scent of pine resin and frozen earth. Every breath felt like chewing a piece of ice. The Northern Manor lay at the edge of this wasteland. It was larger than I had imagined, and far more silent than the rumors suggested. It was a massive grey Gothic structure, its towers and spires, piled layer upon layer, beneath a leaden sky, like a closed, dust-covered old book. Ivy covered the outer walls of the east wing, but the vines had all withered, leaving only shriveled, dark brown branches that clung to the stone walls like countless spasming fingers. Directly in front of the manor lay a wide gravel courtyard. The fountain in the center was dry, its stone basin piled high, with dead leaves blown in by the wind. The carriage was parked in front of the gate. The gate was made of oak, so tall that one had to look up to see the top, with rusty iron hinges nailed to it. On either side stood a stone beast, its features so weathered by the wind that it was impossible to tell whether it was a lion or a wolf. I stood on the gravel, holding my suitcase, and the cold wind instantly pierced through my cloak. It was late October in the north, and the temperature had dropped so low that my breath condensed into white mist. The gate opened. A man who looked like a butler stood in the entranceway. He was probably in his 50s, with graying hair combed immaculately, and a dark uniform pressed to perfection. But his face, how to put it? The wrinkles on his face weren't carved by age, but by some kind of chronic tension. The corners of his mouth were turned up in a smile, but the muscles above his cheekbones were stiff, as if he were wearing a mask that didn't quite fit. "Miss Ashby," he said with a slight bow. "I am Crawford, the estate's steward. His Grace the Duke is attending to military affairs, and will return this evening to dine with you. Please follow me." His voice was polite, precise, and flawless, yet every syllable seemed measured with a ruler. He turned and walked ahead, his leather shoes tapping out a rhythmic, cold, hard rhythm on the black marble floor. I followed him into the Duke of Ashton's home. If I had to describe the interior of the estate in one word, I would choose suffocating. Not ugly, but suffocating. The hall soared at least 3 stories high, its dome adorned with faded Baroque murals. The faces of angels and saints had grown indistinct under years of soot, like a flock of ghosts trapped on the ceiling. The walls were hung with portraits of successive Dukes of Ashton, dark oils, heavy brushstrokes, each face colder than the last. The fire in the hearth burned brightly, yet it failed to warm the space. The heat rose and dissipated, swallowed whole by the soaring dome. Everything sparkled: gilded candlesticks, silverware, crystal chandeliers. But it was a dim, dulled glow, oxidized by time and veiled in an invisible layer of dust. I followed Crawford down a long corridor. My footsteps echoed back and forth in the empty hallway, as if someone else were following close behind. Mirrors hung on the walls at regular intervals, and as I passed, I caught glimpses of my reflection. A green cloak, red hair, and hands clutching an old leather suitcase, frozen crimson. Amid those ancient, somber oil paintings, my figure seemed out of place. I was led to a room on the 3rd floor of the west wing. The room was large, with a chandelier hanging from the center of the ceiling. The curtains were made of heavy, deep blue velvet, and a sliver of pale sunlight filtered through the gap where they were parted. The bedposts were carved with intricate patterns of vines and roses. The linens were new, and the starched linen gave off a clean, cool scent. On the dressing table sat a silver-rimmed mirror, an oil lamp, and a ceramic vase filled with dried lavender. There was also a book on the windowsill. I walked over and picked up the book. It was Seaby Flora of Northern England. On the title page was a line of handwriting, the ink already faded to brown. To AI, may you find spring in the north. E. Eleanor. I gently placed the book back on the windowsill where I'd found it, my fingertip lingering for a second on the line of text. The handwriting was elegant, the strokes ending with a slight upward curve, as if the writer could never help but look on the bright side. Crawford cleared his throat at the door. I turned around. "Dinner begins at 7, miss," he said. "The evening gown has been placed in the wardrobe. His Grace the Duke has." He paused. I could have sworn I saw his Adam's apple bob, as if he were struggling to swallow a warning. "Quite strict requirements. regarding dining etiquette. The door closed softly behind him. I was left alone in the room, with only the howling wind outside the window, sounding like a low growl. I walked over to the wardrobe and pulled open the doors. 3 dresses hung inside, dark gray, navy blue, and black. The styles were all similar: high collars, long sleeves, tightly cinched waists, and narrow, straight skirts. No lace, no ribbons, not a single piece of superfluous adornment. They hung there like 3 exquisitely crafted prison uniforms. I chose the dark gray one and put it on. In the mirror appeared a woman who was a complete transformation from the one at yesterday's banquet. My hair was pulled back too tightly, and my eyes and brows bore the exhaustion of a long journey. The only splash of color was the thin silver chain around my neck, dangling a garnet the size of a grain of rice. A keepsake from my grandmother, the only piece of jewelry from the set my father had bought, for my mother with his first paycheck that had made its way to me. As night fell completely, the sound of the wind outside grew louder. It wasn't the howling gusts of a gale, but a continuous low-pitched sound, like the groan of some enormous creature in the distance. The manor's stone walls trembled ever so slightly in the wind, and the candlelight flickered in time with them. At 5 minutes to 7, Crawford knocked on my door and led me to the dining room. The dining room was in the east wing of the estate, requiring a walk through the main hall, down a tapestry-lined corridor, and down a short flight of stairs. The walls on either side of the stairs had no windows. Instead, there were 2 rows of iron candlesticks. The flames flickered wildly in the draught, casting the butlers and my shadows onto the stone walls, stretching and shrinking, shrinking and stretching. The dining room door stood open. Inside, it was simpler than I had imagined. A long mahogany table that could seat 20 at most, but at that moment only 2 candles were lit. A set of cutlery was laid out at one end of the table, and another at the other. Between them lay a distance of at least 15 feet and a vast, dim expanse. He was already there. The Duke of Ashton sat at one end of the long table, his back straight as a stone statue in a church. He had changed into dark casual attire. The collar of his shirt was buttoned all the way to the top, and the candlelight made the angles of his face appear even sharper. The plate before him was empty, and beside him stood a glass of untouched red wine, its liquid appearing almost black in the light. The sound of my footsteps echoed loudly in the empty dining room. He looked up and glanced at me. His gaze swept from my face to the dark gray dress, lingered for a moment, then withdrew. "Sit," he said. The butler pulled out a chair for me. The chair legs scraped across the marble floor, emitting a sharp, drawn-out sound that was particularly jarring in the overly quiet dining room. I sat down, facing a full set of silver cutlery, spoon, knife, and fork, arranged neatly in order of size, like surgical instruments. A servant carrying a soup tureen slipped silently in through the side door, set the soup down, and slipped out just as silently. His movements were as light as if he were treading on cotton. It was cream of pumpkin soup, fragrant and scalding hot. I scooped up a spoonful, but before I could bring it to my lips, "How much does your family owe?" The Duke's voice came from the far end of the long table, flat and cool, as if he were asking what the temperature was today. My spoon hung in midair for 2 seconds. Then I calmly brought the soup to my mouth. The sweetness of the pumpkin and the creaminess of the broth melted on my tongue. I swallowed and looked up. £12,000, I said, my voice as steady as my own heartbeat. Mostly land mortgages and 2 loans from the Royal Treasury. 6,000 is principal, the rest is interest, penalties, and my father's ever-growing expenses to maintain appearances. I didn't flinch. Since I'd boarded the carriage bound for the north, I'd had no intention of lying or beating around the bush about these matters. The Duke looked at me, his jaw tightening slightly. Then he reached for the untouched glass of red wine, swirled it gently, sniffed it, and set it down again. 12,000, he repeated, his voice devoid of emotion. Do you know that £12,000 could feed an entire infantry regiment of the Northern Army for 4 full years? I don't know, but I imagine you'll tell me. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Too blunt. If my mother were here, she'd surely be kicking me under the table. But the Duke wasn't angry. He simply picked up the glass and took a shallow sip. The candlelight reflected 2 tiny points of light in his gray, blue eyes like stars glinting off the ice. Your father isn't the first nobleman to try to sell his daughter to me, he said, his tone as steady as if he were reading a military report. Over the past 3 years, at least 7 families have treated this dining room like an auction house. Their offers varied. Some included land, others votes. One even brought a private letter from His Majesty the King, hinting that the position of next Chancellor of the Exchequer would be mine if I simply nodded. He set down his glass. I turned them all down. Do you know why? Because you don't like being treated as a pawn, I said. Number. He narrowed his eyes slightly. Because I don't like them pretending they aren't pawns. The words cut through the air like a thin-bladed knife, silent yet utterly precise. The dining room fell silent again. A servant entered to clear the soup plates and serve the main course, roast venison with wild mushroom sauce. The venison was sliced so thinly that the juices spread across the porcelain plate like a small, dark brown lake. I cut a small piece but didn't eat it. I set down my knife and fork. My lord, I said, my voice neither submissive nor defiant. Since you've made your position so clear, I see no need to pretend any longer. I am here indeed because of my father's debts. But you had me seated in that carriage not because you've suddenly taken a liking to the Ashby family. You have your own plan. He looked at me, saying nothing, his expression impassive, but in those eyes, in the depths of those eyes, there was something akin to approval, like an underground river flowing beneath the ice. Go on, he said. You need a lady, I said, looking him straight in the eye, or at least someone who looks the part. The northern estate needs a mistress, not for love, nor for an heir, but for appearances. The royal cabinet is watching you closely. The queen's health won't hold out past next spring. The crown prince's forces are gathering in the south, and you hold 20,000 private soldiers and a northern legion lurking menacingly at the border. At this juncture, being unmarried is not a freedom, it is a vulnerability. An unmarried duke has no ties, no weaknesses, and therefore no collateral that would reassure the royal court during negotiations. I took a deep breath, clasping my hands on my knees, my fingernails digging into my palms. A wife is that collateral. At least, that is how it appears. The atmosphere in the dining room suddenly grew heavy. The candlelights flickered in unison, and the steam from the venison rose and dissipated before me. The Duke leaned back in his chair, tapping the tabletop lightly twice with the fingers of his left hand. You're clever, he said. The words came out of his mouth, not as a compliment, but more like a hunter confirming his prey had stepped into a preset trap. But you've overlooked one thing. What? He stood up. The chair scraped back with a dull, grinding sound. He walked around the long table, step by step, toward me, the candlelight casting his tall, silent silhouette across the entire wall. He stopped in front of me. He looked down at me. I didn't ask you to marry me, he said. His voice was so low it seemed meant only for my ears. I merely had you put into the carriage. There's a world of difference between the two. I looked into his eyes. Then why did you bring me here? He didn't answer immediately. His hand rose, hovering in midair, as if to touch my face. But in the end, it simply remained suspended there, an inch of cool air separating his fingertips from my skin. Because you corrected a Latin error in the library, he said. Because in this world, there are many who would run away from a banquet, but only one person I've ever seen who would stop to correct a dead man's spelling mistake. He withdrew his hand, turned, and walked toward the dining room door. Halfway there he stopped. Starting tomorrow, Crawford will show you around the estate. The east wing, stay away from it, especially that room at the end of the corridor. That door is locked, and there is only one key. And I have it. You may roam freely through the west wing and the main building. The library is on the ground floor. The collection isn't extensive, but I think you'll like it. He turned his head. Moonlight streamed down from the high windows, illuminating the fleeting expression on his face. Not coldness, not detachment, but a kind of profound, almost weary loneliness. As for whether you'll marry a man feared by the royal family, cursed by the entire aristocracy, and whom even the servants dare not look up at, he said, that's a decision you can make after you've lived in this estate for a full month. He left. His footsteps faded down the stone corridor, swallowed by the sound of the wind. I sat where I was, facing a plate of cold venison and a half-full glass of untouched red wine. The moon outside the high window was pale and cold, casting an even gloomier light on the oil paintings of the Duke's ancestors hanging on the walls. They looked down at me from all sides, their eyes holding something that had never changed over the centuries: arrogance, wariness, and a certain sorrow that had been locked away in this estate for generations, impossible to erase. I picked up the wine glass and raised it slightly toward the nearest portrait. To the choice of sobriety, I murmured, taking a sip as the tart liquid rolled over the back of my tongue. And to the fate that cannot be sobered. The night was still long. The wind outside the manor continued to blow, like some ancient voice fashioned from the frozen soil of the north, repeating the name of this land over and over. I returned to my room, took off the dark gray dress, and hung it back in the wardrobe. A distant, drawn-out howl came from outside the window. It was a wolf's howl, not a rumor, but the truth. I stood by the window, gazing through the glass at the wilderness, bleached white by the moonlight, and suddenly recalled the words Eleanor had written on the title page of Flora of Northern England. To AI, may you find spring in the north. Is there really a spring in the north? I don't know, but at least I didn't run away the first time the temperature dropped. The next morning, I was woken by the cold. The chill of late October in the north was like a damp, cold snake slithering in through the cracks in the windows and every fissure in the stone walls, seeping into the bedding and into my very bones. I huddled under the covers, exhaling a puff of white breath, and stared at the unlit chandelier on the ceiling for a long time before finally convincing myself to get out of bed. The moment my feet touched the wooden floor, I sucked in a sharp breath. The floor was as cold as ice, the chill piercing through my woolen socks straight into my bones. Shivering, I made my way to the window and pulled back the heavy velvet curtains. Grayish, white sunlight poured in, illuminating the endless wasteland beyond. Withered wild grass swirled in the wind. The snow on the distant mountains lay a layer thicker than yesterday's, and the sky hung so low it seemed ready to collapse at any moment. Someone was knocking at the door. It was the maid. She was carrying a brass tray with a teapot, teacups, and a small plate of oatmeal cookies. She wasn't very old, 18 or 19 at most, with brown hair pulled back into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. Her apron was bleached white but ironed to perfection. She set the tray on the dressing table, with her head bowed, not looking at me once. "What is your name?" I asked. She paused, as if surprised that I had spoken to her. Then she glanced up at me briefly before looking down again. "Margaret, miss. How long have you been working here?" 3 years, miss. 3 years. So Lady Eleanor was still alive when she arrived. I lifted the teacup, the steam hit my face, and warmth spread from my fingertips all the way to my wrist. "Margaret," I tried to make my voice sound as gentle as possible. Is there anywhere in this estate that I absolutely must not go?" The maid's hand paused. She was making the bed, her back to me, but I could see her shoulders stiffen noticeably. "Miss," her voice suddenly dropped so low, it was almost drowned out by the wind outside the window. "Mr. Crawford will explain the rules to you. All I know is, no one is allowed in that room at the end of the east wing." "Why?" "Because..." Her fingers clenched the bedsheet. "Because what's locked in there isn't an object. It's the truth." I set down my teacup and looked at her. She turned around, her face already pale. "I'm sorry, miss. I shouldn't have said any of that. She made a hasty curtsy and practically ran out of the room. As the door closed behind her, I heard her footsteps in the hallway growing faster and faster, fading into the distance, as if she were afraid of being chased by something. I sat at the dressing table and slowly finished my cup of tea, gazing into the silver-framed mirror. The tea was scalding, numbing the tip of my tongue, yet my back was overcome by waves of chill. "It's not an object that's locked in there. It's the truth." "All right, Ashton Manor. What exactly are you hiding?" Breakfast was served in a small room called the morning room. The room faced east, and the morning sunlight streamed diagonally through the floor to ceiling windows, casting a large patch of warm yellow light on the carpet. It was the only place in the entire manor that didn't feel so suffocating. The walls were covered in pale green wallpaper with silver patterns. Several blue and white porcelain vases sat on the marble mantelpiece, and by the window stood a small harp, its strings dusted with a thin layer of gray. Mr. Crawford appeared at the doorway after breakfast. Today he was wearing a dark gray morning suit, his bow tie tied just as perfectly as yesterday. His expression remained polite yet tense, like a loyal retainer ready to take a bullet for his master at any moment. "Miss, His Grace, the Duke has instructed me to show you around the estate, if it's convenient for you, right now." I stood up and folded my napkin, placing it on the table. He gave a slight nod and stepped aside, gesturing for me to follow. For the next 2 hours, I followed Crawford through corridor after corridor, past room after room with their doors firmly shut. His pace was neither hurried nor slow. Every step seemed calibrated by a metronome. So was his tone of voice, neither high nor low, devoid of any emotion, like a walking instruction manual. The tapestry in the main hall was woven in 16th century Flanders and depicts William Ashton, an ancestor of the Ashton family, slaying King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. Please note the wolf's head crest in the lower left corner of the tapestry. That was the Ashton family's original coat of arms before they were granted the dukedom. This portrait gallery houses portraits spanning 6 generations of the Ashton family. The third portrait from the left is that of the 4th Duchess, Margaret Ashton. After her husband's death in battle, she managed the northern estates alone for 14 years and was known locally as the Iron Lady. It is said she once rode through ice and snow for 3 days and 3 nights just to personally execute a steward who had betrayed the family. The banquet hall hosts an annual estate banquet on the winter solstice, attended by gentry and officers from the 3 counties of the north. The last one was held 2 years ago. After the Duchess's death, it hasn't been held since. His tone remained unchanged as he spoke, but his pace quickened slightly. I noticed it. "Mr. Crawford." I stopped in my tracks. He stopped too and turned around. "Miss, you quickened your pace just now when you mentioned the lady's passing." He was silent for a moment. A faint crack flashed across his tense face, like a hairline fracture in porcelain, gone in an instant. "You observe things very closely, miss," he said, his voice slightly lower than before. "Everyone in this estate has their own rhythm. My rhythm is that with certain topics, one must walk a little faster." He turned and continued on. I followed behind, asking no further questions. But I took those words to heart. We walked through a candlestick-lined corridor, past a massive, north-facing arched window. The view outside made me stop in my tracks. It was a garden. Or rather, it had once been a garden. It was about half the size of a soccer field, enclosed by a cast-iron fence. The paint on the fence had long since peeled away, leaving only rust-stained iron bars and spires overgrown with dead vines. The garden had once held flower beds, fountains, and a gazebo, but now all had been swallowed up by rampant weeds. Withered yellow stalks poked through the cracks in the stones, then were blown flat by the north wind, resembling a frozen golden wave. In the very center of the garden stood a massive oak tree. Its leaves had all fallen, and its bare branches resembled a pair of hands spread wide toward the sky. That was the lady's garden. Crawford's voice came from behind him. He hadn't approached the window. He stood 3 paces away, as if deliberately keeping his distance. The first spring after the lady married into the family, His Grace the Duke had 30 varieties of roses shipped in from the south. She planted every single one with her own hands. Summers in the north were short in those years, but the roses bloomed beautifully. And then the lady passed away, he said. The Duke ordered the garden gates locked. No one has entered since. The servants say that on the night the north wind uprooted the last roses she had planted, all the candles in the east wing of the manor went out. Not blown out by the wind, they went out simultaneously. To this day, no one can explain it. I turned to look at him. His face still bore that deferential yet distant expression. But I noticed his right hand, hanging at his side, clenched into a fist. "Mr. Crawford," I said, "did you like Lady Eleanor?" The question clearly took him by surprise. His lips twitched, his Adam's apple bobbed once. Then he lowered his eyes and spoke in a voice that had lost all its usual precision. "No one dislikes her, miss, no one." He turned away quickly, cleared his throat, and resumed his businesslike tone. "This way, miss, the library is downstairs." The library was indeed downstairs, at the far end of the west wing on the ground floor, behind a heavy oak door. The moment Crawford pushed the door open, I nearly gasped. It was the most beautiful library I had ever seen. It wasn't large, certainly not on the scale of the ostentatious private libraries my father had seen in the homes of his aristocratic friends in London. But the room was 2 stories high, with a vaulted ceiling rising to the second-floor level, topped by a circular skylight through which sunlight poured down, bathing the walls lined with books. The bookshelves were made of dark walnut, stretching from the floor all the way up to the base of the dome, their edges carved with intricate patterns of vines and leaves. The air was thick with the scent of old pages, leather, binding glue, and a faint whiff of camphor. Warm and cozy, a stark contrast to the bone, chilling cold outside. By the window stood a very old leather armchair, a faded woolen blanket draped over the armrests. On the small round table beside it sat an unlit oil lamp, and next to the lampstand lay a pair of glasses. Gold-rimmed, their lenses covered in a layer of dust. "His Grace the Duke's private library," Crawford said, standing in the doorway. "He rarely comes here. Since the lady's passing, he's been here perhaps 2 or 3 times, but he has instructed that you are free to make use of it." I stepped inside, my fingers gently tracing the spines of the books. Most were in English, though there were also volumes in Latin, French, and even a few in Greek. Works on history and military strategy made up nearly half the collection. The other half consisted of poetry, philosophy, and botany. The gold embossed titles on the spines glinted with a dull sheen in the sunlight. As I read the titles one by one, my heartbeat quickened without my realizing it. A complete catalogue of mosses and lichens of the North poems, the poems of Milton, ancient English heraldry, on the improvement of defensive works on the northern frontier, the poems of the Bronze Tywin. My hand paused. Next to Sifiti the bronze poem sat, a deep blue cloth-bound volume with no title. There was no gold lettering on the spine, no number, no mark of any kind to identify it. I pulled it out and flipped it over to the back cover. On the inside of the leather binding, a small E was written in silver ink. I turned the book over, my fingers resting on the cover, hesitating to open it. A cloud drifted past the skylight, blocking the sunlight, and the light in the library dimmed instantly. Dust particles suspended in the air like frozen snow in the fading light. "Miss," Crawford's voice came from the doorway, carrying a restrained yet unyielding firmness. "If you have seen anything in that notebook, please, for His Grace the Duke's sake, pretend you know nothing of it." I turned to look at him. His face appeared unusually aged in the dimming light. The wrinkles were not etched into his skin, but carved into his bones. "Why?" I asked. He did not answer. He merely gave a slight bow and took a step back. "The tour of the estate is at an end, miss. Lunch is at 1 o'clock. Should you require anything, please ring the bell in your room. Margaret will come." He left. His footsteps faded down the corridor, finally muffled by the heavy oak door. I stood alone in the library, holding Mrs. Eleanor's notebook. The cloud outside the skylight drifted away, and sunlight fell once more, casting its glow upon the deep blue cloth. The silver E glinted in the light, like a long-buried coin finally unearthed. I opened the notebook. The first page had no date, no title, only a single line written in faded brown ink, the handwriting matching that on the title page of Thyve, the Flora of Northern England. "Crawford thinks I don't know what he goes to the East Wing for every night at midnight. But I do. I just dare not say it, because if I did, I would have to admit I didn't marry a man, but a cursed tomb." The page trembled slightly beneath my fingertips. The wind outside suddenly picked up, sweeping across the waves of withered grass on the moor, emitting a low, mournful wail that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. I closed the notebook and slipped it back into its place. When I withdrew my fingers from the spine, my fingertips were already ice-cold. I stood in the patch of light beneath the skylight, motionless for a long time. I didn't eat much at lunch. I spent the afternoon in my room packing my bags, hanging the clothes I'd brought one by one into the wardrobe, placing them next to the 3 dresses, dark gray, navy blue, and black. My clothes were all from London, and their colors were, after all, a bit brighter: a burgundy day dress, a dark green velvet gown, and an ivory, white high-necked blouse with a circle of tiny wild daisies embroidered around the collar. These clothes seemed out of place in this estate, but I had no intention of putting them away. In the evening, Margaret knocked on the door, bringing a pot of freshly brewed tea and a folded note. The handwriting on the note was firm and sharp, each stroke of every letter like a blade slicing through the paper. "Come to the library after dinner. A. Ashton." I turned the note over and over in my hands 3 times, then folded it and placed it in the drawer of my dressing table. The tea was scalding, so I sipped it slowly, watching the sky outside grow darker by the minute. Dinner was quieter than yesterday's. The Duke sat at one end of the long table, a plate of barely touched grilled fish before him. He asked no questions and made no comments about my family's debts. He simply ate in silence, occasionally glancing up at me. I couldn't tell if his gaze was scrutinizing or something else. It was just heavy, as if weighed down by unspoken words. It wasn't until the servants cleared the main course plates that he spoke. "Did you see the garden?" "I did. It's been neglected for a long time. It shows." He didn't respond. He swirled the wine glass halfway between his slender fingers, the red liquid forming a thin film along the glass's surface. He studied the glass for a moment, then set it down without taking a sip. "The library is at the end of the corridor," he said, standing up and pushing back his chair. Without waiting for my reply, he turned and walked out of the dining room. His footsteps echoed a few times in the stone hallway before fading away. I sat at the table for a little while longer. The candle in front of me had burned down to a third of its length. Wax dripped down the candlestick, solidifying into white streaks on the silver base. I took a deep breath, stood up, placed my napkin on the table, and followed him out. 2 oil lamps had already been lit in the library. One stood on the round table, the other in a niche beside the bookshelf. The wicks were trimmed short, and the flames burned steady and quiet, casting the spines lining the walls in a spectrum of deep and light golden brown hues. The Duke stood beneath the arched skylight, his back to the door, gazing up at the sky outside, which had grown completely dark. The skylight was small, framing only a narrow strip of deep blue night sky and a few exceptionally bright stars. He had changed out of his dinner attire and was now wearing a dark gray turtleneck sweater and black casual trousers, his sleeves rolled up to mid-forearm. He held a glass of whiskey in his hand. The amber liquid glowed warmly in the light. When I walked in, he didn't turn around. "Have you ever wondered," he said, his voice sounding particularly low amidst the surrounding bookshelves, "why a duke doesn't marry?" I walked 2 steps behind him and stopped. "I have," I said, "even more so after last night." "And your conclusion?" "There are 3 versions of the conclusion," I said, clasping my hands in front of me, my voice unconsciously dropping to a whisper as if speaking in a church. "The official version is that after your first wife's death, you were overcome with grief and refused to remarry. London's aristocratic circles all say this, calling you a lovesick madman." He showed no reaction. "The semi-official version is, you didn't want to give the royal family any leverage over you, so you refused any marriage proposals. This version is the most widely circulated within the cabinet." He still showed no reaction. "The 3rd version," I paused, "is what I thought of after reading a book this afternoon." He turned his head in the lamplight. His gray-blue eyes took on a metallic sheen of silver, gray as he looked at me quietly, intently. "What book?" "Lady Eleanor's notebook." His fingers paused on his wineglass, that almost imperceptible movement, the joints of his index finger and thumb tightening simultaneously. His knuckles turning slightly white, lasted about a second, then he relaxed. "You read it?" "Just 1 page, the first page." He was silent for a long time. The wind howled a little louder outside, squeezing through the cracks in the skylight and causing the oil lamp's flame to flicker in unison. The shadows of the books on the wall swayed along with it, and the entire library seemed to shiver in an invisible cold draft. "Then tell me about the 3rd version you thought of," he said. I took a deep breath, and my heart began to race again. But this time it wasn't out of fear. It was because I knew that once the words that followed were spoken, they could never be taken back. "The 3rd version is, you didn't marry not because you didn't want to, but because you didn't dare, because Mrs. Eleanor's death wasn't due to illness, at least not entirely, because there is something in this estate, something more dangerous than political rivals, that is gnawing away at everyone who comes near you. Your refusal to introduce anyone isn't arrogance or coldness. It's you pushing everyone away, as far away as possible." He turned to face me directly. Just then the wick in the lamp popped, emitting a faint crisp crackle. Half his face was illuminated by the light, half shrouded in shadow. His eyes, at the boundary between light and dark, glinted with a light I couldn't quite define. Was it pain or relief? "You've left one thing out," he said. This was the 2nd time. He set his glass down on the round table and took a step closer. His hand rose, and this time it didn't stop mid-air. His fingertips, cold, calloused fingertips, gently brushed the thin silver chain above my collarbone. The garnet pendant swayed slightly beneath his touch, refracting a pinprick of red light. "Are you afraid?" he asked. His voice was low and soft, as if he were asking himself. I looked into his eyes. If I were afraid, I wouldn't have corrected that Latin error. The corner of his mouth twitched, that same expression that wasn't quite a smile. But this time, the curve lingered for a second longer before fading slowly, bit by bit. He withdrew his hand, turned away, and gazed through the skylight at the brightest star in the cold night sky. Tomorrow I'm going on an inspection tour of the Legion's garrison. It'll take 3 days round trip, he said, his voice returning to its usual businesslike flatness. Go through all the remaining books in this room. As for that blue notebook, put it back where you found it once you're done. He walked to the door and paused. I'll be back in 3 days. If you're still here, we'll talk about Eleanor. The door closed. His footsteps were quickly swallowed by the sound of the wind in the hallway. I stood beneath the skylight, looking up at that small patch of night sky framed by glass. The brightest cold star was still twinkling, on and off, as if sending a signal that only stones in the wilderness could understand. I walked over to the bookshelf, pulled out the deep blue cloth, bound volume, and settled into the old leather armchair, holding it close. The woolen blanket carried a faint scent of cedar. I pulled it over my knees and turned to the second page. On the morning of the third day, Crawford did not appear in the breakfast room. Margaret came to bring me tea. Her hands were trembling as she set the tray down in front of me. The clinking of the teapot lid against the pot sounded particularly sharp in the quiet morning room. Her complexion was even worse than yesterday's. The skin beneath her eyes was a grayish blue, as if she hadn't slept a wink all night. I didn't press her for answers. The servants at North Manor seemed to share a certain unspoken understanding. There were some things left unsaid, not because they didn't want to speak them, but because once spoken, they would become something that could never be taken back. Like a spell, like a key unlocking a door from the inside. After breakfast, I walked alone along the path Crawford hadn't finished showing me yesterday. This time there was no butler to guide me, no measured out descriptions, only the sound of my own footsteps echoed through the empty stone corridors. I found myself walking very softly, not out of fear but out of instinct. The estate was too quiet, so quiet that any extra sound felt like it was disturbing some deep slumber. At the end of the north corridor was an armory. Its walls hung with swords and muskets dating from the Crusades to the Napoleonic Wars. Inside glass cases lined with faded velvet lay rusty medals and yellowed battlefield reports. I noticed 3 long swords hanging on one wall, each hilt engraved with the same wolf's head crest, identical to the one on the tapestry in the main hall. Plaques hung beneath the other 2 swords: Edward Ashton, Battle of Waterloo, and Charles Ashton, Crimea. There was nothing beneath the 3rd sword. The blade was shorter and narrower than the other 2, with several deep notches along the edge. It didn't look like an exhibit. It looked more like something hastily brought back from a battlefield, not yet catalogued. Just as I was about to step closer for a better look, a voice suddenly came from behind me. That sword belonged to Dane Ashton, the current Duke's elder brother. I spun around. Crawford stood in the doorway, his back straight as a rod, holding a silver tray with an unsealed letter on it. His expression was even more inscrutable than yesterday's, but his voice remained as steady as ever, unnaturally steady. My brother, I repeated. Colonel Dane Ashton, his lordship the Duke's full brother, 7 years your senior. He was killed in action during the Indian Rebellion, so the official records state. Crawford stepped inside and placed the tray on the glass cabinet. Miss, this letter arrived from London this morning. It is in your father's handwriting. I picked up the letter, but did not open it immediately. I looked at Crawford. That is what the official record states. I repeated his words. But what of the actual record? Crawford was silent for 3 seconds. The fire in the hearth crackled once. Sparks spattered against the iron grate and died out. You should ask His Grace the Duke yourself, he said. I merely wish to remind you, every sword in this estate has a story. There are some stories that, once the lady learns of them, she begins to fall ill." Having said this, he bowed and turned to leave. His pace remained as measured as ever, each step falling in time with the metronome. I stood in the armory, clutching my father's letter, my eyes fixed on the sword without a nameplate. The notches on the blade appeared particularly dark in the dim light, like a row of unfinished words. My father's letter was short, only 3 lines. "Lily, the Queen's condition took a turn for the worse this morning, and the Cabinet has convened an emergency meeting. If you haven't given up yet, please ensure the Duke signs the marriage contract before the end of the month. The future of this family now rests entirely on your shoulders." I folded the letter and slipped it into my pocket. When my fingers brushed the bottom of my pocket, they touched something else. A small scrap of paper I'd brought from the library, on which I'd copied a passage from Eleanor's notebook. The very passage I'd finished reading this morning in the early light. It was from the middle of the notebook. The preceding dozens of pages were filled with botanical observations. The dates roses were transplanted, the effect of northern frosts on lavender, the flow rate of snow melt from distant mountains into the garden's drainage ditches. The handwriting was elegant and orderly, like the daily pastime of any noble woman seeking solace in solitude. But on a page somewhere in the middle, the handwriting suddenly changed. From neat and elegant, it became scrawled and hurried. Some letters even pierced the paper, the ink bleeding into small patches of blue like bloodstains. That was what Eleanor had written while the Duke was away on his rounds. She wrote that she had heard a sound at the end of the East Wing corridor. Not the wind, not a mouse, but a rhythmic, unceasing tapping, as if someone were knocking with their knuckles. She sent Crawford to investigate. The butler turned pale on the spot, but insisted it was merely air rushing through the pipes. Eleanor did not believe him. The following evening, she had a maid accompany her to the far end of the East Wing. The door was locked, but light was seeping out from beneath the crack. It was not candlelight, nor the glow of an oil lamp. It was a faint, bluish glow, like the will-o'-the-wisps of a marsh. She stood before that door and heard someone inside reciting a poem. Milton's Poetry. She recognized the poem. She had once been in the library and gently corrected a spelling mistake with a pencil. "Are you afraid?" I asked. The question lingered for only a moment in the library's silence, before being drowned out by the sound of the wind rushing in through the window. The Duke turned his head and said nothing more. He downed his whiskey in one gulp, his Adam's apple bobbing, then set the glass down and walked toward the door. My fingers tightened around Eleanor's notebook, the edges of the pages cut into my fingertips, cold and sharp. Outside the window, that cold star still twinkled above the skylight, flickering on and off, on and off. On the 3rd night, the first snow of the year, fell in the north. I was awakened by the cold in the middle of the night. The coals in the brass stove had gone out at some point, and cold air seeped in through every crack in the stone walls, turning the entire bedroom into an ice cellar. The sound of the wind outside suddenly ceased, replaced by an extreme, almost oppressive silence, the kind of stillness that only a snowy day can bring. Wrapped in my blanket, I walked to the window and wiped the condensation from the glass. The snow was falling heavily. Large flakes descended thick and fast from the depths of an invisible sky, engulfing the wasteland, the withered grass, the distant mountains, and the gravel road leading to the estate. The entire north had turned into a blank sheet of paper, upon which stood only Ashdown Manor, a black, silent, Gothic colossus crouching amidst the wind and snow. Just as I was about to turn and go back to bed, I saw a shadow. Not a person, not an animal, a beam of light, a faint bluish glow seeping through the window at the very end of the east wing. It flickered, then went out, then came back on. Rhythmically once, Twice, 3 times. I stood at the window, my palm pressed against the icy glass, feeling the rhythm of that blue light's flickering echo in my own pulse. Margaret's unspoken warning this morning, Crawford's vague remarks outside the wild garden, the increasingly shaky handwriting in Eleanor's notebook, and the Duke's whispered parting words. "I'll be back in 3 days if you're still here. We'll talk about Eleanor." The blue light in the east wing flashed again. This time it stayed on for a long while, so long that I almost thought it would never go out. Then it did, and the entire estate sank back into the darkness of the snowy night. I turned around, took my cloak from the coat rack, and draped it over my shoulders. My woolen socks pressed against the wooden floor, each step producing a faint creak. I pushed open the door and stepped into the hallway. The hallway was empty. All the candles had been extinguished. Only a faint oil lamp for night lighting glowed at intervals along the walls. My feet seemed to have a will of their own. They carried me through the west wing corridor, past the north-facing arched window, beyond which the garden had been blanketed by a thin layer of snow, and the bare branches of the oak trees had turned white, like a skeleton wrapped in a shroud. My steps did not falter. I descended the short flight of stairs, passed through the tapestry-lined gallery, and headed toward the east wing. The corridor grew narrower and darker. The oil lamps on the walls went from one every 10 paces to one every 20. The light dim enough to barely illuminate the space 3 feet in front of me. A scent I had never encountered before filled the air. Not mold, not dust, but a cold metallic sweetness, as if distilled and sealed away from some long ago summer, only to slowly rot here in this corridor. At the end of the corridor, that door, just as the rumor said, it was locked. A heavy oak door, older, wider, and more silent than any other door in the estate. The bronze doorknob was engraved with the Ashton family's wolf-headed crest, and a key was inserted into the keyhole below the crest. Not made of bronze, not of iron, but of a dark silver metal that glowed coldly in the dim light of the oil lamp. "There is only one key, and I have it." The Duke's voice echoed in my mind. I stared at the key. It sat in the lock, its silver surface reflecting the faint glow of the wall lamp, like an eye lurking in the darkness. I reached out, my fingertips just an inch from the key, and then I stopped, not because I was afraid, but because I heard a sound. On the other side of the door, someone was speaking. It was a man's voice, low and hoarse, as if he hadn't had a drink of water in a very, very long time. He was reciting poetry. Milton's poetry. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. The voice paused for a moment, then it spoke again, this time softer, more hoarse, as if conversing with someone. "Eleanor, is that you?" My blood ran cold in that instant. It was my 3rd night at Ashton Manor. Outside the window, snow was falling in thick flakes. The blue light at the end of the east wing corridor flickered in and out from under the door, and on the other side of that door, a man forgotten by the world for many years was reciting the poem his late wife had corrected the spelling of. He mispronounced it. Just like the error on the book plate, he read it as Edier, splitting it into 2 parts. The man of the Ashton family, locked away at the end of the east wing, had also shattered the word adhere. The snow continued to fall. Winter in the north had indeed arrived early this year, and I stood before that tightly locked door for a very long time, until the blue light faded completely, until the voice behind the door became a faint murmur and then fell into total silence. I returned to my room, took off my cloak, and crawled back under the cold sheets, but I knew I would not fall asleep again. On the other side of that door, what was locked away was never some family scandal, much less the source of a curse. It was a person, a man named Ashton, who was supposed to have died in battle in India. Colonel Dane Ashton's sword bore no nameplate, but his grave was not in India. His grave was this estate. He was still alive. The Duke returned to the estate, at dusk on the fourth day, a day earlier than he had said. When I heard the sound of hooves, I was in the library, transcribing excerpts from the latter half of Eleanor's notebook. The handwriting grew increasingly scrawled, and some pages were so smudged with water that they were almost illegible. Whether from tears or rain, she hadn't written it down, and I couldn't tell. The notebook ended on the very last page, bearing only a single sentence. He finally left the key behind. I don't know if this is a sign of trust or a curse, but I won't ask any more. Just as I closed the notebook, the sound of hooves clattering over gravel reached my ears from outside the window. I walked to the window, parted the curtains, and saw 3 black horses galloping toward the estate through the swirling snow. The lead horse stood half a shoulder taller than the other 2. The rider wore no military uniform, only a thick, dark gray woolen cloak, its shoulders and brim dusted with a thin layer of snow. Before the horses had even come to a complete stop, he had already swung himself down from the saddle. The movement was crisp and decisive, like a blade snapped by the wind. Crawford ran out, umbrella in hand. He tossed the reins to the groom, accepted something handed to him by the butler, a leather document case, dark brown with dark red sealing wax on the flap, and then walked through the main entrance without looking back. From the skylight in the library, I could see everything happening under the main entrance porch. His pace was quick, much quicker than usual. The hem of his cloak billowed behind him like a flag without a coat of arms. He paused under the porch for about 3 seconds, looked up, and glanced at a window on the 3rd floor of the west wing, exactly in the direction of my room. Then, he pushed open the door and vanished into the depths of the main building. I sat back down, returned Eleanor's notebook to its place on the shelf, and let my fingertips linger for a second on that faded silver signature. From the distant hallway came the sound of hurried footsteps, the butler's hushed voice, and the muffled thud of a door being flung open and shut. The entire estate seemed to have suddenly awakened from hibernation, and a faint, taut tension filled the air. Half an hour later, Crawford knocked on my door. His face showed no sign of distress, but his hand, the one clasped behind his back, was clenched tightly, his knuckles as white as marble. "Miss His Grace the Duke requests your presence in his study now." The study was on the 2nd floor of the main house, a room I had never been permitted to enter before. Crawford led me through the main hall, up the spiral staircase, and stopped at the end of a corridor carpeted in deep red. He pushed the door open for me, then stepped slightly aside to let me enter on my own. He did not follow. The door closed softly behind me. The Duke of Ashton's study was more austere and more oppressive than I had imagined. The walls were entirely paneled in dark oak. There were no tapestries, no oil paintings, only the entire north wall fitted with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, crammed with military treatises, atlases, and old leather-bound documents. The desk was massive, carved from a single block of northern oak. On the surface sat a desk lamp with a green glass shade, a brass inkwell, and the leather document case I'd spotted through the window moments earlier. The wax seal had been broken, cracking into several dark red shards scattered across the desk. The Duke stood behind the desk, his back to the door and facing the window. He had changed out of his riding coat and was now wearing a dark gray turtleneck sweater. The sleeves rolled up past his wrists. Outside, the sky was growing dark. The last streak of leaden light fell upon him, casting a long shadow across the oak floor. He heard my footsteps, but did not turn around immediately. Across from the desk stood a hardwood chair with a backrest so straight it was nearly perpendicular to the floor. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for him to speak. A faint, distant thud came from outside the window, not thunder, but snow snapping a pine branch. The sound of ice crystals rustling as they fell from the branches drifted in faintly, like a murmur of many voices from far away. He finally turned around. My first thought was he hadn't slept in 3 days. I wasn't exaggerating. The exhaustion on his face wasn't caused by mere fatigue, but by something deeper. His eye sockets were slightly sunken. The line of his jaw was tauter than usual, and his lips were chapped to the point where the edges were turning white. But his eyes were terrifyingly alert. His gray-blue pupils glinted with an over-vigilant light in the dim glow, like a wolf that had been hunted for too long yet still refused to fall. "Where should I begin?" he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was hoarse, low, and flat, each word seeming to be laboriously dragged from the depths of his throat. "With Eleanor," I said. He was silent for a long time. Long enough that I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he walked over to the bookshelf, pulled a thin, black-covered booklet from the top shelf, and placed it on the table in front of me. It was a death certificate, issued by the London parish, bearing the seal of the Anglican bishop, dated 2 years and 8 months ago. The cause of death column read complications from pneumonia. "This is for outsiders," he said, tapping the certificate with his finger, then turning to the next page. The next page wasn't the certificate. It was a letter. The paper had yellowed and grown brittle, with creases at the edges from being folded and unfolded repeatedly. The handwriting was in dark blue ink, the strokes ending in a faint upward curve. E. Eleanor. The letter contained only 3 lines. "E. I'm not sick. Your brother knocked on the door again tonight. He said you wouldn't forgive him, but he wanted me to tell you he's memorized all of Milton's poems. I'm too afraid to sleep now. I'm sorry." I looked up at him. His face was expressionless, as if all emotion had been drained from him long ago, leaving only the shell known as the Duke of Ashton. "Dane was in the Indian Rebellion. He wasn't killed in action," he said, his voice dropping so low, it was almost drowned out by the wind outside the window. "He's still alive, but his spirit was completely shattered during the final 3 months of the rebellion. After being captured by native guerrillas, he was held captive in the jungle for a full 11 months, and no one could find him. 7 months after the Corps announced him as killed in action, a mining exploration team found him in an abandoned tin mine. He was alive, but he was no longer the man he had been. That night, he strangled the young sentry guarding him with his bare hands. A 19-year-old boy. He kept repeating, over and over in English, the words the sentry uttered as he died. The Duke paused for a moment. "You aren't real." He believed that beyond the mine shaft lay hell. My throat tightened, and my fingernails dug into the palms of my hands without my realizing it. "After Mother's death, Father believed he was his only heir," the Duke continued. "He personally flew to India with 2 battalions to bring him back. Dane was secretly transported back to the Northern Manor. The Royal Military Police arrived that same month to try Dane Ashton on the spot, not for war crimes, but for making deals he shouldn't have. The local rebels didn't kill him immediately after capturing him because people back in Britain had paid them to keep him locked up. It took me 4 years to figure out exactly who those people were." "The royal family?" I asked. The corner of his mouth twitched. "Distant relatives of the royal family, a faction in the House of Commons, and 3 noble families who once sought to annex the Northern Legion's territory. Dane was merely an accident. His military prowess threatened the interests of too many. Rather than kill him, it was better to let him live and turn him into a madman. A mad Colonel Ashton serves as a better warning than a dead one. Look, this is what happens to those who refuse to kneel before London." "So, where is he now?" "Locked away at the far end of the East Wing," he said. "He chose not to come out. Not a day has gone by since the night of Eleanor's accident that I haven't struggled with the urge to throw the key into the fire and melt it." His voice dropped. "But the letter she left behind made it clear. Don't push away those who care about you anymore, Alistair." I suddenly recalled what Crawford had said outside the wildflower garden. After the lady's accident, the Duke ordered the garden gates locked. Since then, nothing she planted has ever survived. How did the lady pass away? I tried to keep my voice steady, but the last syllable of that word still faltered. He turned and walked to the window, raising his right hand to rest on the window pane, his face half hidden in shadow. Wind and snow lashed against the glass behind him, and the window frame creaked faintly. 3 months after Dane was secretly brought back to the estate, Eleanor found him, he said. She began visiting him in the East Wing, reading Milton to him, and his mental state actually improved. But before long, the royal spies grew suspicious of the goings on at the estate. They believed Dane Ashton was truly alive and in his right mind, hiding in the north to plot something. That was the most direct threat I ever received, a secret letter from Buckingham Palace, worded with the utmost gentleness. Yet every word carried the weight of a blade. The letter stated that if he was not handed over immediately, a Royal Treasury investigation delegation would be dispatched to the north to verify the line of succession and all land contracts. Then one night, Dane suddenly remained lucid for a long time. He recognized me, recognized Crawford, asked about father, and then he began to cry. He begged me to let him out of here, saying that his very existence would only pit the entire family against the crown. He said his life wasn't worth dragging everyone down with him into the quagmire of lies. I didn't promise him anything. I don't know how much Eleanor heard from outside the door. The next morning, her fever spiked to 40 degrees. I gripped the armrests of the chair. The sharp edges of the cold mahogany dug into my knuckles, stinging. No one knew, he said. The doctor sent by the church said it was indeed pneumonia. Only I knew it wasn't. Only I knew that the night before, she had walked at least 3 miles barefoot in her nightgown across the wasteland in 20 below weather. It was the night watchman who found her out in the fields, simply because, at dinner, she'd spotted what looked like a cavalry torch to the southwest. Fearing that spies sent from the south were approaching the estate, she wanted to get there before anyone else and lead them away herself. She was alone on that road. That is how she died. For me, simply because she was my wife. He fell silent. The sound of the wind and the crackling fire in the room took turns dominating the only sounds in the room. Outside the window, night had fallen completely. I watched his silhouette by the window and saw his shoulders tremble slightly, almost imperceptibly, in the silence. He quickly regained control. I stood up, walked around to the desk, and reached out. My fingers gently rested on the back of his hand, which was braced against the window pane. His skin was as cold as a stone freshly dug from the snow, yet it tensed sharply the moment it touched my palm. "Is this why you've been pushing everyone away?" I asked. He turned his head. His gray-blue eyes were mere inches away, a storm of silence and restraint. He looked at my hand resting on his, but did not pull away. "The footprints you left at the entrance to the East Wing," he said, his voice hoarse, almost breaking. "The night watchman told me at dawn." My fingers froze. "Aren't you afraid?" he asked. I looked him straight in the eyes and didn't answer. Then I stood on tiptoe and pressed a feather, light kiss to the side of his jaw. It wasn't a ceremonial gesture, nor was it entirely love. It was a resolve. A decision I'd made on the third night, while listening to Milton's echoing sobs outside that locked door. His breath caught for a moment. Then he raised his other hand and very slowly, placed it on the back of my head. The touch was as light as cradling a snowflake falling from the window. A knock sounded from outside. Crawford's voice pierced through the door, a touch more urgent than usual. "Your Grace, an urgent message." The Duke withdrew his hand from my hair, turned away, and pulled the door open. The butler handed him another secret letter, sealed with wax so deep red it was nearly black, containing not a single superfluous word. He unfolded the paper and read it from beginning to end. From the side, I saw his Adam's apple bob twice. Then he folded the paper, placed it in a desk drawer, and locked it. "The Queen passed away last night," he said, his voice now steady again. "The heir apparent will travel directly north from Windsor Castle, passing through York tomorrow. They will make a detour to Ashton Manor before sunset to see my newly wife with their own eyes." I stood in that study, enveloped by the grey-blue night snow, and listened to those words. The heir apparent was coming. London was coming. All the secrets locked away in the East Wing and sealed in waxed letters would soon no longer belong solely to the North. "I will not be afraid," I said. The Duke looked up at me. The candle flickered nearby, its warm glow sweeping across his high brow and gaunt cheekbones. He said nothing more, but simply reached out and gently wiped away the moisture at the corner of my eye, a tear I hadn't even noticed myself. His hand was still cold, but this time it lingered for a long while. That secret letter, sealed with deep red wax, remained locked in the desk drawer for only one night. Early the next morning, the entire Ashton Manor entered a state of tense yet orderly preparation, unlike anything I had ever seen. Before dawn, Crawford stood in the main hall, holding a parchment list, and assigned tasks to the servants in his usual, unnaturally calm tone. The tapestries were to be beaten clean, all the silver candlesticks polished, the crystal chandelier in the banquet hall lowered, so every candle holder could be inspected, and the iron door in the East Wing corridor. He read this item without a pause in his voice. To be secured with an additional lock, using the chain removed from the armory last year. The key to be entrusted to His Grace the Duke himself. I overheard this exchange from the landing of the staircase, turned around, and walked back to my room. Margaret was already waiting in the room. She was hanging a dress I had never seen before in my wardrobe, made of deep forest, green velvet, with intricate vine patterns embroidered in silver thread along the neckline and cuffs, a high waistline. The skirt flared out from the waist like an inverted dark calyx. Beside the dress lay a pair of low-heeled satin shoes in the same shade and a dark silver gray silk shawl. I stood in the doorway, but didn't get to finish my question. "Left by the lady," Margaret said, her head bowed, her fingers still smoothing the pleats of the skirt. "Mr. Crawford had it brought from the East storage room this morning. He said that today you are the Duchess of Ashton, not like, but are." I walked over and touched the silver vine embroidery on the skirt with my fingertips. The stitching was fine and fluid, the curve of every leaf so precise, it looked as though it had been traced from a rose leaf in the garden. When Eleanor was alive, she must have once stood in this gown beneath the crystal chandeliers in the ballroom, holding a glass of wine and smiling at the aristocrats from the south. Back then, she had no idea that Milton's poetry would one day be misquoted by a madman locked behind a door. "Help me put it on," I said. Margaret looked up, and something flashed in her eyes, not a glint of tears, but a light that had been suppressed for a long time and had finally found an outlet. She nodded, her movements more precise than I had ever seen before. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the first clatter of hooves came from the gravel road to the south. I stood by the arched window in the main hall, looking out through the leaded glass. 3 black carriages were making their way across the thin layer of snow on the moor toward the estate, each drawn by 4 black horses. There were no coats of arms on the carriages, but a small, almost inconspicuous crown emblem was engraved on the brass lamp holders by the doors. The carriages were followed by a small squadron of light cavalry. Their deep blue uniform capes stood out starkly against the snow, and the swords at each man's waist tapped lightly against their thighs with the rhythm of the horses' movement. 3 carriages. The royal family said they were merely passing through. Yet they brought an entire escort and enough attendants to fill 3 compartments. The Duke of Ashton stood 2 paces behind me. He wasn't in uniform, but wore a dark gray wool morning coat, with the wolf-headed crest I'd seen in the armory's glass case pinned to his left lapel. The crest was silver, blending almost seamlessly with his coat in the hazy light, flashing a cold gleam only at certain angles. "You remember what I said?" He turned his head and lowered his voice. "Stay within 3 steps of you at all times. Ask no questions, answer none, and when you smile, don't let the corners of your mouth rise more than 15 degrees. I repeated. The corners of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, but the gap between that and a smile was narrower than it had been yesterday. "One more thing. If the envoy asks when you got engaged," he said, his voice so soft that only I could hear it, "you'll say, 'Last fall in London. At an afternoon tea party in my great-aunt's garden. It was raining that day, and you were holding a dark green umbrella. Last fall. I hadn't even..." He knows you weren't of age. He also knows I'm lying. But he dares not call me out on it, because that afternoon tea party did indeed take place. My great-aunt did indeed invite your father, and your father did indeed not attend. Something was burning deep within his gray-blue eyes, cold and steady. The rules of the game among the aristocracy have never been about telling the truth. It's about leaving your opponent with no evidence that you've lied. I took a deep breath, swallowing those words, and set them alongside the things he'd said to me last night in the study. The carriage came to a stop outside the porch. The first to step out were 2 men in black casual attire, lean and muscular with broad shoulders and narrow waists. They stood motionless in the snow, like 2 knives planted in the ground. Next came 4 young nobles, who appeared to be attendants, dressed in lavish attire, but with cautious expressions. The moment they stepped out, each of them scanned the surroundings, their eyes sweeping over every high window and shadowed corner of the estate. The last to step down was a middle-aged man in a dark blue robe. He was not tall, one might even say he was on the short side, his shoulders sloping slightly forward, his hair a neat, grayish white. His face was round and unremarkable. Placed on any street in London, he would vanish instantly into the crowd, but his eyes, those deep brown eyes, where the edges of the pupils were almost indistinguishable, made every hair on the back of my neck stand on end the moment they swept over the arch of the porch. Those were not the eyes of a human. They were the eyes of one accustomed to watching people from the shadows. His Excellency Ian Sharp, second counselor to the Privy Council. Crawford's voice sounded behind me, low and even. His title is Baron, but no one in the cabinet calls him by it. Everyone calls him the shepherd dog, because he's loyal, because he never bites. He's only responsible for leading the lead sheep to the butcher. By the time Sharp stepped into the vestibule, a perfectly measured smile had settled on his face. That smile was neither cold nor warm, neither too much nor too little, as if it had been measured out. "Duke of Ashton." He gave a slight bow, his tone gentle and courteous. "Her Majesty specifically instructed me on her deathbed to pay you a visit while passing through the north. She said the north should not always be forgotten. Her Majesty's grace, the north remembers." The Duke's voice was so steady, it held not a single ripple. His back was straight as a rod, his right hand hanging naturally at his side, his fingertips brushing against my wrist. It was an infinitesimal movement. To an outsider, it would have looked merely like 2 people standing side by side adjusting their distance. But in that instant of contact, the warmth from the inside of his wrist washed over me. He was confirming that I was still here. "And this is..." Sharp's gaze shifted to me. "My wife, Lily Ashton," the Duke said. He spoke calmly, as if he were merely noting that it had snowed again today. But the moment those 4 words fell from his lips into the air, I felt the temperature in the entire porch drop by 3 degrees. Sharp's smile remained unchanged, yet the light in his eyes gradually dimmed, like the aperture of a camera adjusting its focus. "Madam." Sharp gave a slight nod. his gaze lingering on my face for about 3 seconds. During those 3 seconds, I felt as though I were being peeled away layer by layer. From his perspective, he must have seen a slender young woman, with her hair pulled back tightly, wearing a dress that had once belonged to the late former Duchess, her fingers curled slightly at the hem, the curve of her lips precisely calibrated to a safe, inoffensive smile. But he saw more than that. His gaze lingered for a moment on the slender silver chain above my collarbone, then withdrew. "His Grace is truly surprisingly efficient," Sharp said, his tone as gentle as ever. "Last winter the cabinet was still debating your celibacy, and by this autumn you've already tied the knot. It seems the snow in the north may be deep, but it cannot freeze certain resolves." The Duke did not respond to this remark. He merely turned sideways and made a gesture of invitation. "Dinner is ready." Dinner was served in the main banquet hall. The very hall Crawford had mentioned had never been used since the lady's passing. Every candle in the crystal chandelier was lit, and the warm yellow light refracted from hundreds of crystal facets, bathing the entire hall in a glow that made it resemble an ice cave filled with firelight. A snow-white linen tablecloth stretched the length of the long table, with silver candlesticks placed every 3 steps. In the center of the table sat the last sprig of rosemary rescued from the greenhouse. Its leaves were already turning slightly yellow, though this was imperceptible in the candlelight. I was seated to the Duke's right, directly across from Sharp. His seat was directly opposite mine, separated by the sprig of rosemary and 2 rows of silver candlesticks. Every subtle expression on his face was clearly visible in the flickering candlelight. He didn't size me up immediately, but instead exchanged a few casual remarks with the Duke about the snow conditions and the roads up north, his tone as relaxed as if 2 old classmates had bumped into each other at a club. But I knew it wasn't casual. It was like a hunter taking his first few steps through the woods, light and slow, leaving no trace. "I hear you are the daughter of the Forster family?" Sharp suddenly turned to me. "I am." I smiled. The corners of my mouth turned up 15 degrees. Mr. Forster's situation in London lately, pardon my bluntness, seems rather strained. Several shipping investments have run into stormy waters, and some private loans have become rather less respectable as a result. Here it comes. My heart gave a sharp jolt, but the smile on my face remained unchanged. The Duke had taught me the rules of the game among the aristocracy are not about telling the truth, but about leaving your opponent with no evidence that you've lied. And right now what I needed wasn't evidence, but time. "My father always believed that fair weather follows the storm," I said. "It's just that this storm has lasted a little longer than usual. And, His Grace, the Duke is your fair weather." "Lord Sharp." The Duke's voice came from my left, as matter of fact as a discussion of the snowfall outside the window, to discuss whether a husband is fair weather in his presence. "What sort of decorum is that in London?" Sharp laughed, lifting his glass to take a sip. It wasn't a genuine laugh, but the kind where laughter is used as punctuation. My apologies, my apologies. There's been so much going on in London lately that propriety has gone to hell. Her Majesty's coffin hasn't even been removed from Buckingham Palace, and the date of the new king's coronation has already been changed 3 times. At the meeting in Windsor last month, several ministers raised the issue of the Northern Legion's military expenditures. They said the Duke's forces have expanded by at least 20% in recent years. Yet Westminster has never received a formal bill for that expansion. The Duke set down his knife and fork. The metal clinked softly against the porcelain plate. The air in the entire banquet hall froze after that faint sound. "The Northern Corps' last expansion was 6 years ago," he said, his voice quiet, but every word carrying weight. "That year, requests for 6 regiments were sent from my study to London. 5 of them were shelved by the cabinet. The 1 regiment that was approved was later transferred to the Sudan and has not returned to this day. Lord Sharp, when you speak of 20%, Are you referring to those 5 regiments that were never officially recognized? Sharp's smile remained unchanged, but he swirled his wine glass halfway between his fingers without taking a sip. Under the table, I quietly clenched the velvet hem of my skirt. He was more dangerous when he was silent than when he spoke. Your Grace's memory for numbers is truly admirable. Sharp set down his glass and picked up his napkin to wipe the corner of his mouth. In that case, I'm sure you're well aware, once the new king ascends the throne, the cabinet will be reshuffled. Tax audits, military expenditure reviews, and land title registrations across the 7 counties of the north will all be re-examined. This will likely take place in about a month. The banquet concluded around 9 o'clock. His lordship Sharp and his entourage were assigned guest rooms in the southeast wing. Crawford personally escorted them there, and when he returned, his face was as pale as the plaster statues in the hallway. I stood beneath the skylight in the library, waiting for the Duke, clutching the garnet pendant in my hand. Warmed by my body heat, it glimmered faintly in the starlight filtering through the skylight. The Duke entered without lighting a lamp. He stepped out of the darkness, his footsteps lighter than usual. But I knew it was him. That faint scent of cedar reached me before his silhouette did. 1 month, he said. His voice was flat. What he said at the end of the dinner, the land title review. I turned to face him. Who was that aimed at? He was silent for a moment, then walked over to the bookshelf and pulled another document from the same shelf where he'd last taken Eleanor's death certificate. This one was thicker, bound in dark brown craft paper, its edges already frayed. The estates of all 3 counties in the north, nominally belonging to the Duke of Ashton, though in reality, 20% belong to Dane Ashton. If a person does not exist in the eyes of the law, his inheritance rights are reverted to the Royal Property Office for redistribution. He placed the document on the round table. Under the Queen's reign, no one dared touch this document. The first thing the new king will do after his coronation is carve up the north and hand it out to those who took the right side at the ceremony. They don't want money, they want to ensure there is no longer an Ashton in the north. So he needs a reason, I said. A reason that would strip the Ashtons of their inheritance rights during the review. The Duke said nothing. I understood. That reason was me. If Sharp could prove my marriage was a sham, a fraud orchestrated to create a legitimate heir on the eve of the review, then both the Duke of Ashton's and the House of Dane's estates would be seized by the Royal Property Office. They would uproot the House of Ashton, using legal documents instead of swords, silently and without a sound. Sharp will ask to see me alone tomorrow, I said. The Duke raised his eyes. He'll produce something, proof of the Foster family's debts, or proof that we were never formally married in London, or something else. Then he'll give me a choice. I clenched the garnet pendant. The sensation of its edges cutting into my palm kept me alert. Cooperate with London, accuse you of treason, and he'll help the Foster family have all their debts forgiven. And then? The Duke asked. And then I'll say no. I looked into his eyes. My voice was quiet, but every word seemed to be squeezed out from between my teeth. Not because I married you. It's because from the very night I arrived, I chose to trust you. And until now, you've never given me a single reason to doubt that trust. He set the documents back on the table and stepped toward me. His hand rose, long knuckled fingers swept through the stray strands of hair by my ear, his fingertips resting on my temple. His hand was trembling. This was a man who could patrol the border for 3 days without sleep in wind and snow. Yet his hand trembled slightly, uncontrollably, the moment it touched my hair. Lily, he said my name, not Miss Foster, not Miss, not any distant form of address, just Lily. Then he lowered his head, his forehead pressing against mine. His breath was cool, carrying the scent of whiskey and cedar, his eyelashes so close they became a blurry gray shadow before my eyes. He said, in a voice so low it sounded like a confession to a priest, "I don't want to push anyone away anymore." I closed my eyes, breathing in his breath. The brightest winter star outside flashed against the skylight, as if sending a signal known only to itself. At noon the next day, Sharp walked into the morning room, just as expected. I was drinking tea at the small round table by the window. The harp Eleanor had left behind stood silently behind me, its strings covered in dust. I was wearing that white shirt with the high collar. The wild daisy pattern at the neckline stood out sharply in the sunlight streaming through. These flowers had been embroidered in a garden down south. They didn't originally belong to this stone manor surrounded by wasteland. But now they were here. Sharp didn't beat around the bush. He sat down, pulled a sheet of paper from the leather briefcase he carried, and placed it before me. It was a comprehensive list of the foster family's debts, detailing every high-interest loan my father had taken out over the past 3 years. At the very bottom, a figure was circled in red ink, a sum nearly 40% higher than what my father had tearfully told me over the phone all those years ago. "I don't need an answer right now," Sharp said, his tone as gentle as a grandfather telling a child a bedtime story. "I just want you to understand one thing, Miss Foster, or should I call you Mrs. Ashton? When you married into this estate, you didn't sign an ordinary marriage contract. You signed a deed of property transfer, a pass that allows 2 Ashtons to stand on solid legal ground. This isn't love. It's a mortgage. The price you will pay for this mortgage is far greater than you imagine." He stood up, left the list of debts on the table, and gave a slight bow. "The carriage will depart at dusk. By then, if you are willing to accompany me to Windsor to provide the necessary background information for the Royal Property Office's review, all of the foster family's debts will be settled within this month, paid directly from the Treasury." He walked to the door, paused, and turned his head. His deep brown eyes looked particularly gentle in the sunlight. "Your father cannot wait much longer." The door closed. I quietly sipped the last drop of tea from my cup, folded the list of debts into a small square, and placed it under the base of the unlit oil lamp on the table, next to my glasses and gloves. Then I stood up, walked to the harp, reached out, and plucked the lowest string. The string vibrated. A faint, low hum cut through the dust and trembled in the sunlight for a long time. My father truly could not wait much longer. But the one who truly could not wait much longer was never ever him alone. Come evening, I slipped back into that deep forest green velvet dress. Eleanor's dress. The silver vine embroidery at the waist glowed faintly in the candlelight, like a blank letter she had left behind. As Margaret was helping me pin up my hair, she caught sight of my expression in the mirror and paused with the comb in her hand. "Miss, no, madam, you look as if you're going to war today." "More or less," I said. I entered the temporary reception room Lord Sharp had used before his departure. As the door was drawn shut behind me from the outside, the Duke was in the main hall, checking the departure time of the carriages with the captain of the light cavalry accompanying him. He would not know that I already held the decisive move in my hand. Sharp stood by the fireplace, putting on his gloves. The moment he saw me, a smile spread across his face, a gentle, assured smile, the kind a hunter wears when the lead sheep walks toward him. "You're here," he said. "I'm here," I said, placing what I was holding on the table. "But I'm not here to go with you, your lordship the shepherd." It was a tiny dark green velvet pouch, its opening drawn tight with a slender silver cord. Sharp's smile remained unchanged, but his pupils contracted slightly. I untied the pouch and emptied its contents onto the table. An old brass locket, stamped with the Ashton family's wolf, headed crest on the front and engraved with 2 lines of text and a date on the back. Dane Ashton, survivor of a prisoner of war camp, and the date of the first time he had been lucid enough to speak his own name after being secretly returned to the north. I retrieved this from the East Wing, I said calmly. The spy you sent to the north last fall wasn't there to determine whether Colonel Ashton was still alive, but to confirm that he had gone completely mad and would never be able to publicly testify against you, was it not? The colonel wasn't held in the rebels' mines during his captivity. He was kept in a special cell built at British expense, with no other prisoners, only a continuous loop of the London Stock Exchange broadcast. He didn't go mad from torture, but from hearing things he shouldn't have. And then, using the same methods, they made him lock those secrets away in his shattered heart. Sharp's hand paused at the second button of his glove. In the glow of the fire, his face suddenly lost its round, gentle appearance. That mask, meticulously maintained for 20 years, cracked open a hairline fissure in the dull light reflected from the brass locket. "Do you know," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "when the Duke told me the entire plan last night, I asked him, 'Once this secret is revealed, there will be no room left for the North and the Crown to pretend there is peace,' he said he knew." I paused, clenching the brass locket tightly in my palm. "Your 1-month deadline is null and void as of this moment. What truly begins its countdown now is not the North's defenses, nor my father's debts, nor the Ashton family's land deeds. It is all the lies you will need to fabricate anew before you return to Windsor to report to the new king that Colonel Dane is still alive. You are free to bring men here at once and raze this estate to the ground. But as long as he lives, the man who, years ago, spent a third of the British Treasury's overseas budget to build a private dungeon, he will never again sit securely on the throne." Sharp was silent for a full 10 seconds. A log in the fireplace burst into flames, sparks spattering against the iron grate before dying out. Then he removed his glove, folding it slowly, bit by bit, and tucking it into his pocket. "Are you certain you know what you're doing, Duchess of Ashton?" "I know," I said. "I'm becoming a threat worth eliminating in your eyes." He stared at me for a long time. Then he turned away. "The snow of the north hasn't frozen anything after all," he said, walking toward the door, his footsteps much lighter than when he'd arrived. "Give my regards to His Grace the Duke. Tell him the new king's coronation. The cabinet expects representatives from the north to attend. 2 seats have been reserved, 1 for the Duke and 1 for the Duchess." He glanced back at me before getting into the carriage. "That dark green umbrella from last fall, change the color navy blue suits you better. Not a single drop of rain falls in the north once winter sets in, and I'm looking forward to seeing how long you can keep that umbrella open." The carriage vanished into the snow. I stood under the porch as the wind blew in from the north, seeping into my collar and pulling the thin silver chain around my neck tight against my skin. The Duke's footsteps came from behind me, and he stopped beside me. He didn't speak right away, but simply draped a heavy gray cloak, warm with his body heat and the scent of cedar, over my shoulders. "He doesn't have the upper hand," I said. "That's why he kept trying to lure me away from you right up until the very last moment." "I know," he said, looking down at me. Snow had begun to fall again at some point. Tiny ice crystals settled on his hair and eyelashes without melting. Standing there in the snow, his gray-blue eyes appeared exceptionally deep against the white backdrop, like 2 stones that had been washed by snow melt for a very, very long time. "When Eleanor left, I thought I would freeze to death here in this estate," he said, lifting his hand to brush the snow from my shoulders, flake by flake. "But then you came." He lowered his head, his lips touching mine. Snow fell between us, cold and soft, then melted away with our breath. A month later, on the eve of the new king's coronation, the north was hit by the heaviest snowfall of the winter. The entire Ashdown estate was buried under 2 feet of snow. The distant mountains and the moors had all turned the same color. I stood at the window of the morning room, gazing at the white expanse, when Margaret came in to bring me tea. My lady, Mr. Crawford, asked me to tell you. The gentleman in the East Wing recited the entire book of Milton this morning, without a single mistake. I drained the hot tea from my cup and stood up outside the window. The iron gate to the wild garden had been opened at some point. Snow covered the weeds and withered vines. The ruins had become an endless white canvas. The heavy snow had buried everything dead, while everything alive still lay waiting beneath. I pushed open the gate and stepped into the garden. The Duke was standing there, his back to me, gazing up at the bare branches of the oak tree. He heard my footsteps and turned around. I want to replant this garden. For a fleeting moment, a crack appeared in the depths of his eyes. But what followed was not pain. It was light. He held out his hand, palm up, his 5 fingers slightly parted in the cold air. I placed my hand on top of his. Spring will come. While everyone else was betting we wouldn't survive the blizzard, only we knew what we were sheltering beneath the umbrella wasn't rain, but the North's first dream that would never freeze.